Uh, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the analysis of the Christ IBMAT. This test was conducted for the first time. So this year, Christ started with their 5-year integrated program, and they are conducting a separate test for this, as opposite to their CUET, which they are conducting for the 3-year BBA program. Okay, so let us quickly run through the analysis of this test. I talked with a few students who had taken this test, and this is what they had to say. First thing, just like their normal CUET, the Christ University entrance test, just like the normal Christ University entrance test, where they mentioned that the test was going to be sectional. Here also they mentioned that the test was supposed to be a sectional test with 50 questions of Kant, 15 in verbal ability, and 20 in general knowledge. But the test was not a sectional test. If you can read here, no split for sections and no sectional time limit. So that means this test was of a complete 90 minutes duration with 120 questions spread across sections. It was a jumbled up test. And not only was it a jumbled up test, but the group questions were also separated. So say, take an example of an LR set. It had 5 questions and it came at 5 different places, not even at 2 or 3 different places. It came at 5 different places. Okay. Same was the case with a reading comprehension. So, this would have, students who attempt an RC or LR set, will be wasting time in this case. Okay, so there were 2 LR sets. Each of those questions were separated. There were 2 RCs. Each of those questions were separated. None of the RC questions were together. None of the LR questions were also together. Okay, so there was no split for sections. There was no sectional time limit. Okay, however, the interface was a very, very user friendly interface. The students that I talked to never said that they found any difficulty. Yes, there was initial hiccups in the sense that uh, you know the starting the test took a little time because you had to install one software that they had emailed you. If you would have installed the software initially, okay, because there were a couple of students who had installed it initially and had taken the demo test also. For them, the test started very, very smoothly. But for those who had not taken the demo test, for them it took time to install the test, because when you install that software, all other applications stops there. You cannot open any other application. If there is any application open, by default it gets closed, and so on. Okay, so if you would have taken the demo test earlier, you would have installed the uh, link earlier, the software earlier, so then you would have not faced any issue. For those who did not, yes, they did find initial hiccup, but that was a minor hiccup, and thereafter it started very smoothly. Okay, so as I said, single section of 120 questions with 90 minutes timer. There was an on-screen calculator. It was a very, very small icon, but there was an on-screen calculator, and it had even some trigonometric inverse ratios and so on. I don't know why, because there were no questions based on those type. Okay, the scoring was also very, very similar to what they had mentioned. For every right answer, you will get 1 mark. For every wrong answer, 0.25 marks will be deducted. Everything was given. Uh, One student, in fact, told me there were no instructions given in the test initially, because most of the times, whenever there is a computer adaptive test or a computer based test, there are sets of instructions which the students are supposed to go through. There were no such instructions which were mentioned at the beginning of the test. Okay, so this was an overall structure as usual. As I said, no sections, 120 questions, 90 minutes, and questions were jumbled up. Let's now go on to and have a look at the verbal ability and the verbal reasoning section. If you look at the verbal ability and the verbal reasoning section, this section comprised of approximately 55 questions out of 120. Out the approximate breakup of those 155 of those 55 questions were, there were two RC passages, uh, roughly around 300 to 350 words. One passage was around 350 to 400 words, was a little bigger than the first passage. The second passage had more words. Okay. The smaller passage, students said, had 8 questions. The bigger passage, students said, had 7 questions. Okay. So roughly 15 questions on RCs. Okay. Then there were lots and lots of fill in the blanks. And fill in the blanks also had a variety in them. That means there was one blank questions, two blank questions, three blank questions, statement one, statement two given, statement one had one blank, statement two had one blank. So there were lots of variations in the fill in the blank questions, approximately 16 questions. Vocab had 6 questions, out of which students said there was an almost an equal spread of 3 questions of antonyms and 3 questions of synonyms. Grammar had 10 questions, and there were very, very similar type of questions like, paragraph given, which of the following sentence fits into the passage, and so on. And there were few verbal reasoning questions, like approximately 10 verbal reasoning questions, standard type of verbal reasoning question, nothing different from what you would have practiced. Okay, so there were approximately 55 questions. Majority of the students whom I talked with said that the verbal reasoning was, the verbal questions were relatively easier. None of them were difficult. None of them were time consuming also. Okay. And the RC passages, as far as the passage is concerned, they said that it was using some very, very simple words. So you could read easily and answer most of the questions quicker. So this was your verbal ability section. The next section would be your cont section. The approximate breakup of cont section is a roughly 30 to 31 questions. Okay. It had questions roughly from all topics, almost equivalent, except arithmetic was a little higher. So you can see number systems had 3 questions, arithmetic had 10 questions, algebra had 5, geometry had 6, modern maths had 7. The number system questions were based on rules of divisibility and basic properties of numbers. Okay, the arithmetic questions were not based on those simple areas like ratios. Two questions were on averages. There was one simple interest, compound interest. I think 2 questions on profit and loss, 1 question on time, speed, distance, 1 question on time and work. Algebra also had 5 questions. There were a couple of questions on linear equations, 1 question on quadratic equation, 1 question on functions. There were students who told me that, normally in a test, when you write an x square, here it was written as x exponent 2. So that square part was missing. The fraction was not given as a fraction. The fractions were given as a division symbol. So, they took that little time to understand that. Okay. Then geometry had 6 questions, with 1 question on mensuration, 1 question on circle, couple of questions on triangles. There was one theory question. There was a definition of radius that they had asked, though options were given, but it was a theory based questions. Okay. Majority of the questions were easy. There were a couple of time consuming questions also. I'll come to that. Modern maths had around 7 questions, with questions on PNC, couple of questions on PNC, one on probability, two series, and so on. Okay. Could not Students could not recall any Venn diagram based questions. Okay. Uh, so this breakup of quant is approximately 30 to 31 questions, and majority of the students whom I talked to said that 26 to 27 questions were straightforward with less time consuming. There were 3, 4, 5 questions which were time consuming. Okay, time consuming meaning they said they were not difficult, but there was a little bit of calculation involved. Calculator was available, but not that kind of a calculation wherein you need to use a calculator. Okay, so it is better to leave out those 3, 5 questions, identify them, and just leave it. Okay. Uh, the next type of questions that I will move on to is logical reasoning. As you can see, there were approximately 10, 11 questions on logical reasoning. There was one linear arrangement set. There was one question on family tree, which two students told me that there was something wrong or fishy in that. The conditions were, contradicting themselves. Okay, there was one question on series completion. There was one puzzle. So there were not many variations on, logical reasoning like directions and, sequential input output, coding, decoding, those types of clocks, calendars, those types of questions were missing actually. Okay, so one linear arrangement set in which they said there were five questions. And as I said right in the beginning, the questions were spread. None of the questions were together. There was a family tree question. There was one series completion. There was one puzzle on, knockout tournament. So it was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, what they told me was there were 200 participants to identify the winner, how many matches to be played, something like that. Okay. So let's move on to the DI section. There were two sets of DI, one with four, the other with five questions. So approximately nine questions. So the two types of questions were line graph and bar graph. Yes, it was a little calculation oriented. That's what the students said. But not again all. There were questions which were simple, which you could do it orally. There were questions wherein, some sort of calculations were required. Okay. Overall, the level of those nine questions were relatively easier. And the last type of questions were GK. There were approximately 15 questions of GK, with approximately three out of those 15 were ethics based questions, and the remaining were equally spread between current affairs and static GK. Okay, so there was maybe one question wherein they were asking who is running. It was on a particular company. I am not able to recall as of now. So current affairs questions were there. Who runs X, basically, those type of questions. Elon Musk was the answer. uh, there were other questions wherein if I'm not mistaken, if I recall, they asked the current home minister of India. Those type of questions were there. Then there were some questions based on 2024 Commonwealth Games and so on. So, this was a basic distribution. Okay, so a rough distribution would be 55 questions on verbal reasoning and verbal ability, approximately 30 questions on quant, approximately 10 questions each on DI and LR, and approximately 15 questions on GK. This was the spread of that 120 questions. So, if I go on to the overall analysis, I would suggest that the test was relatively easier. A good attempt would be anywhere in the range of 90 to 100 questions. And if you go with an 80% accuracy, that means a good score would be around 80 is what we are expecting. Okay, so if you get around 75, 80 marks, I'm sure you will get called for their integrated 5-year integrated program. So I think this is all that I wanted to discuss about the test. If there are any questions, I'm just looking at your chats. If there are any questions, do let me know, guys. I'll just wait for a couple of minutes. If there are any questions, do let me know. Okay, so I don't think there are any questions. So I would stop the analysis here. Thank you very much for joining. And if there are any queries, you can put it on the chat. We will definitely get back to you. Thank you, everyone, and all the best for your next round. Thank you.